November 14th, 1943. Bougainville, Solomon Islands. Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell Paige crouched behind a palm log, his Springfield M1903 rifle resting across the rough bark. The weapon was older than he was. Adopted in 1903, it had been officially obsolete since 1936, when the M1 Garand became the standard American infantry rifle. Every other branch of the United States military had transitioned to semi-automatic weapons. The Army carried Garands. Even the Navy and Coast Guard personnel issued rifles, received the newer M1s. But here, on this blood-soaked island in the South Pacific, Paige and hundreds of other Marine snipers and scouts still carried the bolt-action Springfield, and in approximately 4 hours, when 3,000 Japanese soldiers would charge across 600 yards of open ground toward his position, that obsolete rifle would prove more valuable than any modern weapon in the American arsenal. The mathematics seemed absurd. The M1 Garand fired 8 rounds semi-automatically from an N-block clip. The Springfield fired 5 rounds from an internal magazine and required manual cycling of the bolt between each shot. In any comparison of firepower, the Garand won decisively. A rifleman with a Garand could fire aimed shots at twice the rate of a Springfield shooter, could reload faster, and could maintain suppressive fire more effectively. Military theorists in Washington had spent the 1930s calculating these advantages. They had determined that modern warfare required volume of fire, that future battles would be decided by which side could deliver more bullets downrange in less time. The semi-automatic rifle represented progress, efficiency, modernity. The bolt-action rifle was a relic of the Great War, suitable perhaps for ceremonial duties but worthless in actual combat. The United States Marine Corps disagreed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Not because Marines were traditionalists or because they romanticized obsolete equipment. The Marine Corps had always been pragmatic about weapons, adopting new technology when it provided genuine tactical advantages. They had embraced the M1918 Browning automatic rifle, the M1919 machine gun, even the new flamethrowers and bazookas. But they had also recognized something that desk-bound theorists in Washington had missed. In the Pacific War, in the specific conditions of jungle combat against Japanese tactics, there were circumstances where a slower, more accurate rifle was more valuable than a faster, less precise one. The Springfield M1903 could reliably hit a man-sized target at 600 yards. In the hands of a properly trained Marine marksman, it could do so consistently, repeatedly, with devastating effect. The M1 Garand, with its shorter barrel and semi-automatic action, was accurate too, perhaps 350 yards for aimed fire. Beyond that, its effectiveness dropped significantly. That 250-yard difference seemed trivial in theory. In practice, against Japanese Banzai charges that developed at distances of 600 yards or more, that difference determined who lived and who died. The Springfield's accuracy came from its design. The rifle was 43.2 inches long with a 24-inch barrel. The barrel was heavy, thick-walled, and precisely rifled. The bolt locked with 3 locking lugs that created an exceptionally rigid action. When a Marine squeezed the trigger, there was minimal movement, minimal vibration. The bullet left the barrel in a perfectly straight line, spinning at 2,800 revolutions per second, stable in flight over distances that would cause other bullets to tumble or drift. The rifle fired the .30-06 Springfield cartridge, a round developed specifically for long-range accuracy. The standard military load pushed a 150-grain bullet at 2,800 feet per second, with 2,654 foot-pounds of energy at the muzzle. At 600 yards, that bullet still carried over 1,000 foot-pounds of energy, more than enough to penetrate a human torso, more than enough to kill instantly. But the technical specifications only told part of the story. What made the Springfield devastating in Marine hands was not the weapon itself, but the training that accompanied it. The Marine Corps had maintained marksmanship standards that other services had abandoned as impractical. Every Marine recruit, regardless of his eventual specialty, spent 2 weeks at the rifle range learning to shoot. Not just learning to point a weapon down range and pull the trigger, but actually learning marksmanship, proper breathing, trigger control, natural point of aim, sight picture, and alignment. Recruits fired from the 200-yard line, the 300-yard line, the 500-yard line. They fired from standing, kneeling, sitting, and prone positions. They fired slow fire, where accuracy was paramount, and rapid fire, where they had to maintain accuracy while working the bolt quickly. They fired in wind, in rain, in heat. They fired until hitting targets at 300 yards became automatic, until their bodies understood intuitively how to compensate for wind drift and bullet drop, until marksmanship became as natural as breathing. The qualification standards were brutal. A Marine had to score at least 190 out of 250 possible points to qualify as marksman, the lowest passing grade. Sharpshooter required 210 points, expert required 220. Marines who failed to qualify as at least marksmen were recycled through training until they passed or were discharged from the service. There were no exceptions. Every Marine was a rifleman first, and every rifleman had to prove he could hit what he aimed at. This emphasis on marksmanship created a force unlike any other in the American military. While Army infantry divisions contained thousands of soldiers who had fired their rifles a few times on a qualification range, then never picked them up again until combat, every Marine had internalized the fundamentals of accurate shooting. The average Marine infantryman could consistently hit targets at ranges where Army soldiers were still figuring out which end of the rifle the bullet came out of. Marine snipers and designated marksmen received even more intensive training. They attended special courses where they learned to estimate range by eye, to read wind conditions from vegetation movement, to calculate bullet trajectory adjustments for temperature and altitude. They learned to build shooting positions in jungle terrain, to use natural cover, to remain motionless for hours while waiting for targets. They learned that patience and one carefully aimed, the shot was more valuable than a dozen rounds fired quickly but inaccurately. By 1943, when the Pacific War had been raging for 2 years, these skills had been tested in combat repeatedly. Marines had fought on Guadalcanal, where Japanese night infiltration tactics had been stopped by Marine riflemen who could hit targets in darkness at ranges that seemed impossible. They had fought on Tarawa, where Marines had engaged Japanese defenders at distances measured in hundreds of yards across open beach terrain. They had learned that Japanese tactics created specific opportunities for long-range precision fire. The Japanese Imperial Army had developed Banzai charges as a deliberate tactical doctrine in the years before the war. The concept was rooted in Bushido, the warrior code that emphasized spirit over material, courage over caution, death over surrender. Japanese infantry training stressed aggressive assault, the importance of seizing initiative, the psychological impact of shock action. When defensive positions became untenable, Japanese doctrine called for massed infantry charges designed to overwhelm enemy positions through sheer ferocity and numbers. These charges were not mindless suicide attacks, despite how American propaganda often portrayed them. They were calculated tactical decisions based on sound military principles. A defending force, no matter how well armed, has limited fields of fire. If enough attackers charge simultaneously from multiple directions, some will survive the defensive fire and reach the enemy position. Once in close combat, superior numbers and fighting spirit could overcome advantages in firepower. The tactic had worked effectively in China, Malaya, and the Philippines against forces that lacked discipline or adequate defensive preparation. But Japanese planners had not accounted for Marines who could kill at 600 yards. The typical Banzai charge began when Japanese commanders recognized that their position was lost. Rather than surrender or conduct a fighting withdrawal, they would mass all available troops for a final assault. Officers would brief their men, often reading imperial rescripts that emphasized honor and duty. Soldiers would tie headbands around their foreheads, sometimes writing final messages to families. They would fix bayonets, check ammunition, prepare grenades. Then, at a signal, they would charge. The charge itself was terrifying to witness. Hundreds or thousands of men would emerge from jungle positions or fortified bunkers simultaneously, screaming battle cries, firing rifles from the hip, throwing grenades. The noise was overwhelming, a wall of sound meant to paralyze defenders with fear. The visual impact was equally powerful, a human wave rushing forward with apparent disregard for casualties, each soldier seemingly willing to die if it meant advancing a few more yards. Against unprepared troops, against soldiers who panicked under pressure, the tactic worked. Defenders would break and run, abandoning positions that might have been held with steady nerves. The psychological impact of hundreds of screaming enemies charging directly at your position was difficult to overstate. It required extraordinary discipline to stand firm, to maintain firing positions, to pick targets methodically while death rushed toward you. Marines had that discipline, and they had Springfield rifles that could begin killing Japanese soldiers while those soldiers were still 600 yards away, still forming up for the charge, still beyond the effective range of most infantry weapons. Gunnery Sergeant Paige had seen 3 Banzai charges in his 2 years in the Pacific. The first had been on Guadalcanal in October 1942, when he had been a platoon sergeant with a machine gun section. Japanese forces had charged his position at night, and the fighting had devolved into close-quarters combat where the Marines' advantages in firepower meant little. Paige had fought with his machine gun until it literally melted, the barrel glowing red-hot, ammunition cooking off in the feed tray from residual heat. He had killed dozens of Japanese soldiers that night, had earned the Medal of Honor for his actions, but he had also learned that letting the enemy close to hand-fighting distance negated every American advantage. The second Banzai charge had come on New Georgia in July 1943. This time, Paige had been prepared. His platoon had established defensive positions with clear fields of fire extending 400 yards. When the Japanese charged, Marine riflemen had opened fire at 350 yards with M1 Garands. The volume of fire had been impressive, 8 round clips emptying in seconds, hundreds of bullets streaking toward the charging Japanese. But the accuracy at that range had been poor. Maybe 1 round in 5 found a target. The Japanese had closed to 200 yards before the defensive fire became truly effective. By then, they were inside grenade range. The position had held, but casualties had been heavy on both sides. The third charge, on Bougainville just 6 days ago, had been different. Paige had been attached to a scout sniper platoon, issued a Springfield M1903 with a unertl 8 power scope. His position overlooked a valley that Japanese forces needed to cross to reach the American perimeter. When the charge came, approximately 500 Japanese soldiers had emerged from the jungle 650 yards from his position. Paige had settled behind his rifle, controlled his breathing, found his natural point of aim. The first Japanese soldier in his scope was an officer, identifiable by his sword and the way other soldiers oriented toward him. Paige placed the crosshairs on the officer's chest, accounted for the slight breeze from left to right, exhaled halfway, squeezed the trigger. The Springfield roared. Through the scope, Paige watched the officer pitch backward, dead before he hit the ground. He worked the bolt, ejecting the spent cartridge, chambering a fresh round. 2 seconds. The motion was automatic, ingrained by thousands of repetitions on rifle ranges and in combat. He found another target, a non-commissioned officer gesturing troops forward. Squeeze. Bolt. 3 seconds. Another Japanese soldier fell. The charge was still 600 yards away. Other Marine snipers along the defensive line were firing similarly. Each shot was aimed, deliberate. Each shot found a target. The Japanese soldiers advancing across open ground had no cover, no concealment. They were exposed, vulnerable, dying. By the time they had crossed 200 yards, closing to 500 yards from the Marine positions, over 50 soldiers had fallen. The charge hesitated, momentum faltering. Japanese officers tried to restore order, urging men forward. The Marine snipers killed the officers. The charge broke apart, soldiers seeking whatever cover existed in the sparse vegetation. Of the 500 Japanese who had started the charge, perhaps 300 made it back to their original positions. None had come within 400 yards of the Marine lines. 0 American casualties. That was the power of accurate, long-range rifle fire against massed infantry assaults. Now, on November 14th, intelligence reports indicated that a major Japanese offensive was imminent. Reconnaissance patrols had spotted large troop movements. Radio intercepts suggested coordination between multiple Japanese battalions. Air reconnaissance had photographed supply dumps being established, always a sign that an attack was being prepared. Division intelligence estimated 3,000 Japanese soldiers would participate in the assault, the largest single attack on Bougainville since the American landing 3 weeks earlier. The Marine defensive perimeter was strong but thinly held. 1st Marine Parachute Regiment held the southern approaches, the most likely avenue for the Japanese attack. They had spent the past week improving positions, digging fighting holes, stringing barbed wire, registering artillery. The terrain favored the defenders. An open valley stretched 600 yards from the jungle edge to the Marine positions. Any attacking force would have to cross that valley under observation and fire. Colonel Edward Craig, commanding the 1st Marines, had positioned his scout sniper platoons along the defensive line with specific instructions. They were to engage targets at maximum range using their Springfield rifles. Every Japanese soldier killed at 600 yards was one less soldier reaching the main defensive positions. Every officer killed was leadership lost, coordination disrupted. The snipers were not expected to stop the attack alone. They were expected to attrite it, to reduce its strength before it reached the machine guns and Browning automatic rifles that would bear the main burden of defense. Paige checked his ammunition. 5 rounds in the rifle, 25 rounds in 5-round stripper clips in pouches on his belt, another 100 rounds in boxes nearby. He would not run out. His position was a carefully constructed shooting platform, sandbags stacked to create a stable rest, logs positioned overhead to provide shade and concealment. The field of fire was clear. The valley stretched out before him, marked with range stakes every 100 yards. He settled in to wait. The attack would come at dusk, intelligence suggested. Japanese doctrine favored attacks at dawn or dusk, times when visibility complicated defensive fire but provided enough light for the attackers to navigate terrain. Dusk attacks also meant that if the charge failed, darkness would cover the withdrawal, preventing American forces from pursuing and inflicting additional casualties. The sun dropped toward the horizon. Shadows lengthened across the valley. The jungle came alive with evening sounds, birds calling, insects, humming, normal sounds. Then, gradually, the jungle fell silent. The birds stopped singing. The insects quieted. Marines along the defensive line tensed. Something was happening in that jungle, something that made animals fall silent. At 1700 hours, Japanese artillery began firing. Shells screamed overhead and burst among the Marine positions. The bombardment lasted 15 minutes, a relatively light preparation by Japanese standards. They were conserving ammunition, knowing that their real weapon was infantry, not artillery. When the shelling stopped, the silence seemed oppressive. Smoke drifted across the valley. Dust hung in the humid air. Then they came. The jungle tree line 650 yards distant erupted with movement. Japanese soldiers emerged in a skirmish line, hundreds of them, spread across a front 500 yards wide. They advanced at a walk initially, weapons at the ready, maintaining formation. Officers were visible, swords drawn, positioned at intervals along the line. Flags waved, rising suns on white backgrounds, battalion standards carried forward. Paige estimated 30 seconds before they entered his effective range. He chose a target, a Japanese officer slightly ahead of the main line, clearly visible against the grass. 640 yards, slight crosswind from the left, temperature in the mid-80s, humidity near 80%. He made micro-adjustments to his scope, compensating for the wind, for the distance. The Japanese line closed to 630 yards, 620, 610. At 600 yards exactly, Paige squeezed the trigger. The Springfield bucked against his shoulder. Through the scope, he saw the officer fold in half as if punched in the stomach, then fall, dead or dying, no longer a factor. Up and down the Marine line, other Springfields began firing. The sound was distinctive, a sharp crack different from the heavier boom of Garands or the chatter of automatic weapons. Each shot was deliberate, aimed, lethal. Japanese soldiers began falling, one here, another there, picked off by unseen riflemen 600 yards away. The Japanese advance accelerated to a jog, then a run. The formation began to break down as soldiers instinctively bunched together, seeking the psychological comfort of proximity, even though it made them better targets. The battle cries began, thousands of voices screaming in unison, a sound meant to terrify but also to provide courage to those making it. Paige worked his bolt, chambered a fresh round, found a new target, a non-commissioned officer, recognizable by his slightly different uniform, urging men forward. Squeeze! The NCO went down. Bolt. Another target. Squeeze. Another Japanese soldier fell. His rhythm was mechanical, emotionless. Breathe, aim, squeeze, bolt. Repeat. Every 3 seconds, another round downrange. Every 3 seconds, another enemy soldier neutralized. The Japanese were at 550 yards now, still beyond effective range for most American weapons. The M1 Garands remained silent, their operators conserving ammunition. The Browning automatic rifles were still, waiting for targets to close within their optimal engagement range. Only the Springfields fired, perhaps 30 rifles along the defensive line, each one in the hands of a Marine trained to hit targets at these extreme ranges. Japanese casualties mounted, 50 down, 75, 100. The charge was bleeding strength before it even approached the main defensive line. But 3,000 soldiers charging together could absorb 100 casualties and continue. The mathematics were brutal but simple. 30 Marines with bolt-action rifles, firing once every 3 seconds, could kill perhaps 600 enemies in the time it took those enemies to cross 600 yards of open ground. That left 2,400 soldiers still combat effective. Unless the Springfield shooters were accurate enough that every shot counted, unless they targeted leadership, disrupting command and control, unless they created a psychological impact disproportionate to their actual numbers, making the Japanese believe they faced far heavier opposition than truly existed. At 500 yards, the Marine Garand shooters opened fire. The volume of fire increased dramatically. Where 30 Springfields had been firing methodically, now 300 Garands joined in, semi-automatic fire pouring into the charging Japanese. The noise was overwhelming. Hundreds of rifles firing simultaneously, the sound rolling across the valley like continuous thunder. The Japanese charge hit a wall of bullets. Men fell in groups, cut down by concentrated fire. But the survivors kept coming, driven by duty, by honor, by the knowledge that retreat was not an option. They fired their own rifles as they ran, shooting from the hip, accuracy impossible, but creating at least the impression of returning fire. Some threw grenades, though. At this range, the grenades fell far short of American positions. At 400 yards, the Browning automatic rifles opened fire. These weapons were devastating. Magazine-fed automatic rifles that could fire 500 rounds per minute. Each bar gunner had an assistant who carried additional magazines and could maintain a continuous supply of ammunition. The BARs swept the Japanese line, full automatic fire cutting swaths through the advancing soldiers. At 300 yards, the machine guns engaged. M1919. Brownings, belt-fed, water-cooled, capable of sustained fire at 600 rounds per minute. The machine gun crews had rehearsed their fields of fire, had pre-positioned ammunition belts, had adjusted their guns for precise grazing fire that would catch advancing troops at knee-to-waist height. The machine guns did not fire continuously. They fired in short bursts, 3 to 5 rounds at a time, conserving ammunition and preventing barrel overheating, but each burst was deadly accurate. The Japanese charge was being systematically destroyed. At 300 yards, perhaps 1,800 soldiers remained standing from the original 3,000. At 200 yards, maybe 1,000. At 100 yards, fewer than 500. And still they came, the survivors driven forward by momentum, by the impossibility of retreat, by the absolute commitment that Japanese doctrine demanded. At 50 yards, the charge finally broke. The few dozen Japanese soldiers who had survived the 600-yard gauntlet encountered barbed wire, pre-registered mortar fire, and point-blank rifle fire from Marines in fighting holes. Some died trying to cut through the wire. Others were killed by grenades or by Marines who simply shot them as they tried to climb the barriers. None breached the American perimeter. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The entire action had lasted perhaps 8 minutes from the moment the Japanese emerged from the jungle until the last attacker fell. Of 3,000 Japanese soldiers who had charged, approximately 2,700 were dead or dying in the valley. Fewer than 300 made it back to their original positions. American casualties numbered 17 wounded, 0 killed. The disparity was almost incomprehensible. Paige had fired 37 rounds during the charge. He had aimed and squeezed the trigger 37 times, worked the bolt 36 times between shots, reloaded using stripper clips 7 times. His shooting log, which he maintained meticulously, would show 33 confirmed kills, meaning 33 Japanese soldiers he had watched fall through his scope. The other 4 rounds had likely found targets as well, but he had been acquiring new targets before confirming effects. Other Marine snipers reported similar results. Corporal James Mitchell, positioned 200 yards to Paige's left, recorded 41 rounds fired, 37 confirmed kills. Private First Class Robert Chen, a Chinese-American Marine from San Francisco, fired 29 rounds at officers exclusively, killing 24. The Scout Sniper platoon alone had killed over 400 Japanese soldiers at ranges exceeding 400 yards, roughly 15% of the total enemy force destroyed before that force even came within effective range of American automatic weapons. The Springfield had proven its value again, not because it was better than the M1 Garand in every circumstance, but because in this specific circumstance, against this specific enemy using these specific tactics, its superior accuracy at extreme range made it the perfect weapon. A Marine with a Garand might have fired 60 or 70 rounds during the 8-minute engagement, but his hit percentage at 600 yards would have been perhaps 20%, maybe 30, kills. A Marine with a Springfield fired fewer rounds but achieved an 85 to 90% hit rate, resulting in more enemy casualties despite the slower rate of fire. The Marines had recognized this dynamic early in the Pacific War. Japanese tactics, particularly Banzai charges, created engagement windows at long range where accuracy mattered more than volume of fire. A well-trained rifleman with a bolt-action weapon could exploit that window devastatingly. The Springfield M1903, supposedly obsolete, supposedly inferior to modern semi-automatic rifles, proved itself the superior weapon for this specific mission. The emphasis on marksmanship that made Marines so deadly with the Springfield had not emerged accidentally. It was the deliberate product of institutional culture that dated back decades, rooted in lessons learned from previous wars and reinforced by officers who understood that accurate shooting was a perishable skill, requiring constant practice. The Marine Corps had learned the value of rifle marksmanship during the Spanish-American War and the Philippine insurrection. In both conflicts, American forces had faced enemies who used terrain expertly, who attacked from concealment, who understood that survival depended on not presenting targets. Soldiers who could only hit what they aimed at within 100 yards were at a severe disadvantage against insurgents engaging from 300 yards away in dense jungle or mountainous terrain. The lesson was reinforced in China during the Boxer Rebellion, and again during the Banana Wars in Central America and the Caribbean. Marines fighting bandits in Haiti, Dominican Republic, and Nicaragua discovered that firefights often occurred at ranges where marksmanship training made the difference between victory and defeat. A platoon of Marines who could reliably hit targets at 400 yards could dominate terrain that a less skilled force would have to yield. But the institutional commitment to marksmanship truly solidified in the years after World War I. The Marine Corps had emerged from that war with a reputation for aggressive combat effectiveness, but also with recognition that many Marines had been inadequately trained in basic rifle skills. Too many recruits had arrived in France unable to hit targets reliably beyond 200 yards. Officers studying after-action reports determined that improving marksmanship training would multiply combat effectiveness more than any other single reform. In 1921, the Marine Corps established standardized marksmanship qualification courses that every recruit had to pass. The standards were deliberately set high, higher than the Army's qualification requirements, higher than what many considered practical. Marines had to demonstrate proficiency at distances up to 500 yards. They had to shoot from multiple positions. They had to maintain accuracy under time pressure, and they had to do all of this before graduating from recruit training. The standards created hardship. Recruits spent hours on rifle ranges, firing thousands of rounds, developing calluses on their trigger fingers and bruises on their shoulders from rifle recoil. Many failed their first qualification attempts and had to repeat the training. Some washed out entirely, judged unsuitable for the Marine Corps because they could not shoot accurately enough. But those who passed graduated as genuinely skilled riflemen, capable of hitting targets at ranges where soldiers from other services were still trying to estimate distance. The commitment to marksmanship extended beyond basic training. Marine units conducted regular rifle practice throughout their service. Battalions maintained ranges where Marines could practice shooting during downtime. Company commanders were evaluated partly on their unit's marksmanship scores. Promotions to sergeant and above required demonstrated expertise with the rifle, regardless of the Marines' actual job specialty. A cook who wanted to become a staff sergeant had to qualify as expert rifleman. An administrative clerk seeking promotion had to prove he could shoot. This created a military culture unique among American forces. While the Army treated marksmanship as a specialized skill that some soldiers possessed and others did not, the Marine Corps treated it as a fundamental competency that every Marine must master. The institutional slogan, "Every Marine a Rifleman," was not merely inspirational rhetoric, it was operational doctrine backed by training requirements and qualification standards. When the Springfield M1903 was officially declared obsolete in 1936, and the M1 Garand designated as the new standard infantry rifle, the Marine Corps faced a decision. They could follow the Army's lead and transition entirely to the semi-automatic weapon, or they could maintain the Springfield in specialized roles where its superior accuracy provided tactical advantages. Marine officers debated the question throughout the late 1930s. Those favoring complete transition argued that the Garand's increased rate of fire would multiply Marine combat effectiveness. In close-quarters jungle fighting, the ability to fire 8 rounds rapidly without working a bolt could mean the difference between life and death. The Garand was also more reliable in harsh conditions, less prone to jamming from mud or moisture. And, from a logistics perspective, standardizing on a single rifle would simplify supply chains and maintenance. But other officers, particularly those with experience in Central America and China, argued that the Springfield's accuracy at long range was too valuable to abandon. They noted that Marines frequently engaged targets at distances where the Garand's accuracy degraded significantly. They pointed out that Japanese tactics, based on observations in China, emphasized mass infantry charges that could be broken by accurate long-range fire. And they emphasized that Marine marksmanship training was specifically designed around the bolt-action rifle's characteristics. Transitioning to a semi-automatic weapon would require retraining the entire force. The compromise solution was to issue Garands to most Marines while retaining Springfields for snipers, scouts, and designated marksmen. Each rifle platoon would have a scout section equipped with Springfields, typically 4 to 6 rifles. These Marines would receive additional marksmanship training and would be tasked with engaging high-value targets at extended ranges. Sniper teams would exclusively use Springfields, often fitted with telescopic sights that enabled engagement beyond 600 yards. This decision proved remarkably prescient when the Pacific War began in December 1941. The Marine Corps entered the war with approximately 15,000 Springfield rifles in its inventory, enough to equip scout and sniper sections throughout the force. These weapons, some of them manufactured during World War I, were about to prove their value in circumstances their designers had never imagined. The first major engagement where Marine marksmanship with Springfields proved decisive was not a Banzai charge, but a defensive battle that required precision fire to break up Japanese infiltration attempts. Guadalcanal, August 1942. The Battle of the Tenaru River. Japanese forces had been assured that the Marines were poorly trained, that American soldiers were soft, products of a decadent society that valued comfort over martial virtue. They believed, based on propaganda and on early successes against colonial forces in Southeast Asia, that aggressive night attacks would shatter American defenses. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki led 900 Japanese soldiers in a night assault against Marine positions along the Tenaru River. His plan called for infiltration under cover of darkness, followed by a mass charge at dawn when defenders would be exhausted and disoriented. Japanese doctrine held that Americans feared close combat, that they relied on firepower because they lacked fighting spirit. Get inside their defensive perimeter, Japanese officers believed, and American units would break. Ichiki's forces approached Marine positions silently, moving through jungle in small groups, coordinating by whispered commands and hand signals. They were experienced jungle fighters, veterans of campaigns in China and Malaya. They knew how to move without sound, how to use terrain for concealment, how to close with an enemy before that enemy realized the danger. By 0200 hours on August 21st, Japanese soldiers had infiltrated to within 300 yards of Marine positions without being detected. Then a Marine sentry spotted movement. Private First Class John Rivers, a scout armed with a Springfield M1903, was positioned in an observation post forward of the main defensive line. His job was early. Warning: to spot enemy activity and alert the battalion before attacks developed. Rivers saw shapes moving against the slightly lighter background of beach sand beyond the jungle. He counted at least 20 soldiers, possibly more. He alerted his sergeant by field telephone, then settled behind his rifle. The Springfield was equipped with iron sights, no scope. At night, with limited visibility, Rivers would be shooting at barely visible targets at unknown ranges. But his training had prepared him for exactly this situation. Marines practiced night fire, learning to aim at silhouettes, learning to estimate distance from the size and definition of targets, learning to compensate for the tendency to shoot high in darkness when adrenaline affected muscle control. Rivers fired at the nearest shape. The Springfield's muzzle flash briefly illuminated his position, a risk in night combat. But the shot was true. The shape collapsed. Rivers worked the bolt, chambered another round, fired at a second target. Another hit. The Japanese infiltration was exposed. Marine machine guns opened fire, tracers reaching out into the darkness. Japanese soldiers who had been moving silently suddenly charged, screaming, firing rifles, trying to overwhelm the defensive position through speed and shock. Marine riflemen along the perimeter began engaging targets. Those with Garands fired rapidly, 8-round clips emptying in seconds. Those with Springfields fired more deliberately, each shot aimed, each shot finding a target despite the darkness and confusion. The volume of fire from the Garands was impressive, but the accuracy of the Springfield shooters was deadly. Japanese soldiers fell at ranges exceeding 200 yards, killed by Marines who could barely see them, but who trusted their training and their weapons. The infiltration collapsed into a disorganized assault. Without surprise, without coordination, Japanese forces charged directly into prepared defensive positions. The result was slaughter. By dawn, over 800 Japanese soldiers lay dead on the sand and in the shallow water of the Tenaru River. Marine casualties numbered 43 killed and wounded. The disparity shocked Japanese commanders who had believed their forces were qualitatively superior to American troops. Post-battle analysis revealed that Marine scout sections, equipped with Springfields, had been disproportionately effective during the night fighting. While they fired fewer total rounds than Marines with Garands, their hit rate was significantly higher. Japanese wounded interrogated after the battle reported being shot by invisible riflemen who could kill in darkness, a description that spoke to the psychological impact of accurate fire from unseen positions. This pattern repeated throughout the Guadalcanal campaign. Japanese forces attempted night infiltrations, believing darkness negated American firepower advantages. They discovered that Marine riflemen with Springfields, could engage them effectively even in limited visibility. The bolt-action rifle, slower than a semi-automatic, proved more accurate in the hands of trained shooters who took time to aim properly, rather than spraying bullets in the general direction of targets. But the Springfield's true dominance came in daylight engagements, where Marines could exploit the weapon's long-range accuracy. Tarawa, November 1943. The landing was a disaster, with Marines wading ashore under murderous fire from Japanese fortifications. But once the Marines established a foothold and began reducing enemy positions, the nature of combat changed. Japanese defenders occupied concrete bunkers with firing slits, positions that were difficult to assault directly, but which offered poor fields of view. Marine scout snipers moved forward to positions where they could observe Japanese bunkers at ranges of 400 to 600 yards. From these positions, they engaged any Japanese soldier visible through firing slits or who exposed themselves while moving between positions. The work was patient, methodical. A sniper might wait for hours for a single shot opportunity, but when that opportunity came, the Springfield ensured the shot counted. Gunnery Sergeant Samuel Taxis, a pre-war Marine who had competed in rifle matches before the war, kept a detailed log of his shooting on Tarawa. Over 3 days of combat, he fired 82 rounds, recorded 57 confirmed kills, and estimated another 15 probable kills. Every shot was at ranges exceeding 300 yards. Many were beyond 500 yards. His longest confirmed kill was at 640 yards, a Japanese officer who exposed himself briefly while directing troops. Taxi's experience was not unique. Scout sniper sections across the 2nd Marine Division reported similar results. They were not engaging mass formations. They were picking off individual Japanese soldiers, one at a time, at extreme ranges. But the cumulative effect was significant. Japanese defenders found that any movement drew fire, that no position was truly safe, that their numerical advantage meant nothing when they could not return fire effectively against enemies they could not even see clearly. Japanese after-action reports from Tarawa, recovered later, expressed frustration with American sniper tactics. One report noted that enemy riflemen engage our forces at distances exceeding 600 meters, well beyond the effective range of our weapons. Our soldiers cannot return fire accurately at these distances. The psychological impact is severe. Men become reluctant to move, to perform necessary duties, knowing that exposure may result in immediate death from an unseen enemy. This was precisely the effect Marine doctrine intended. By positioning Springfield armed scouts and snipers at extreme ranges, Marines created zones where Japanese forces could not operate without taking casualties. These zones forced Japanese commanders into difficult choices: accept casualties from long-range fire, or remain in positions that could be reduced by flamethrowers and demolitions. Either way, the defensive position became untenable. The Springfield's effectiveness against Banzai charges reached its peak during the Marianas Campaign in summer 1944. Saipan and Guam featured terrain that created long sightlines, open ground where Japanese charges had to cross hundreds of yards under observation before reaching American positions. Marine commanders positioned their scout sniper sections specifically to exploit these sightlines. On Saipan, July 2, 1944, approximately 700 Japanese soldiers launched a Banzai charge against positions held by the 27th Infantry Division, an Army National Guard unit. The attack came at dawn, with Japanese forces emerging from jungle approximately 500 yards from American lines. The Army troops, equipped primarily with M1 Garands and Browning automatic rifles, opened fire at around 300 yards. The volume of fire was impressive, thousands of rounds downrange, but the hit rate at that range was perhaps 30%. Japanese soldiers fell, but enough survived to close within 100 yards before the charge was finally stopped with heavy casualties on both sides. 2 days later, approximately 900 Japanese soldiers charged Marine positions under nearly identical circumstances. But the Marines had positioned scout sections with Springfields at intervals along the defensive line. These sections began engaging at 600 yards, targeting officers and non-commissioned officers first. By the time the charge closed to 400 yards and the main Marine line opened fire, Japanese command structure had been shattered. Officers were dead. Sergeants who tried to assume command were killed immediately. The charge lost cohesion, soldiers advancing without coordination or leadership. The Marine Garand shooters and automatic weapons gunners destroyed the remnants at close range. Of 900 Japanese soldiers who charged, approximately 850 died. Marine casualties were 11 wounded, 0 killed. The difference between the Army engagement and the Marine engagement was not courage or fighting spirit. It was marksmanship doctrine and the weapons to implement that doctrine effectively. Japanese intelligence officers recognized the pattern. Interrogation reports from captured Japanese soldiers included numerous references to American special riflemen who could kill at extreme ranges. One report, translated by Marine intelligence on Guam, described Marine snipers as death at impossible distances. Another noted that charges against American Marine positions require covering twice the distance under fire compared to charges against Army positions, as Marines engage accurately at 600 meters, while Army units engage effectively only at 300 meters. This assessment was largely accurate, not because Army soldiers were less capable, but because Army doctrine emphasized different priorities. The Army had fully transitioned to semi-automatic rifles and automatic weapons, accepting reduced accuracy at extreme range in exchange for increased firepower at close to medium ranges. This was a rational choice for European combat, where engagement distances were often shorter and where German forces did not employ Banzai charges. But in the Pacific, against Japanese tactics, the Marine combination of Garand-equipped line infantry and Springfield-equipped scouts proved superior. The psychological impact on Japanese forces of facing Marine marksmanship was documented in diaries and letters recovered from dead Japanese soldiers. Private First Class Hiroshi Yamada, killed on Peleliu in September 1944, wrote in his final diary entry, "We are ordered to charge the American positions tomorrow. I do not expect to survive." The Marines kill at distances where we cannot see them clearly. They kill our officers first, so we advance without leadership. They kill our sergeants next, so we cannot coordinate. By the time we are close enough to engage them effectively, we have lost half our strength. This is not warfare. This is execution. Corporal Takeshi Nakamura, captured on Iwo Jima in March 1945, told interrogators, "We were taught that Americans are poor soldiers, that they rely on machines and weapons because they lack fighting spirit. This is a lie. The Marines are excellent soldiers. They shoot better than we do. At distances where our rifles are ineffective, their rifles kill consistently. We cannot win against such marksmanship. Spirit is not enough when the enemy can kill you before you can fight back." These assessments reflected a broader Japanese recognition that their pre-war assumptions about American military capabilities had been displayed catastrophically wrong. American soldiers, particularly Marines, were not soft, were not poorly trained, were not cowards who would break under pressure. They were professionals who had trained extensively in specific skills, including marksmanship, and who employed those skills with devastating effectiveness. The Springfield M1903 was central to this effectiveness. By 1944, Marine Corps leadership had fully validated their decision to retain the bolt-action rifle for specialized roles. Reports from commanders in the field consistently praised the weapon's accuracy and reliability. Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Walt, commanding officer of a Marine battalion on Guadalcanal, wrote in his after-action report, "The Springfield rifle, in the hands of trained Marine marksmen, provides capability to engage enemy forces at ranges where other weapons are ineffective. This capability has proven decisive in multiple engagements, allowing small units to defeat larger enemy forces through superior marksmanship." Similar endorsements came from across the Pacific theater. Commanders recognized that while the M1 Garand was the correct choice for general issue, the Springfield filled a specific tactical niche that no other weapon could match. Long-range precision fire against point targets remained relevant despite the trend toward increased volume of fire. In fact, as Japanese forces became more desperate and Banzai charges more frequent, the Springfield's value increased. The weapon's mechanical reliability contributed to its effectiveness. The Springfield M1903 was designed with exceptionally tight tolerances and robust construction. The bolt locked with 3 locking lugs instead of the 2 found on most rifles, creating a stronger action that could handle higher chamber pressures. The barrel was thick-walled and precisely rifled. The trigger mechanism was simple, with few moving parts to break or malfunction. Marines reported that Springfields functioned reliably in conditions that caused other weapons to fail. The rifle could be submerged in salt water, dried out, and still fire accurately. It could be caked with coral dust or mud, and a quick cleaning would restore function. The bolt action was so robust that Marines could force it closed even with debris in the action, though this was not recommended practice. In an environment where weapons maintenance was difficult and where rifle failures could mean death, the Springfield's reliability was invaluable. The ammunition also contributed to the weapon's effectiveness. The .30-06 Springfield cartridge was one of the most successful military rifle rounds ever developed. The standard military load achieved excellent ballistic performance with moderate recoil, allowing shooters to maintain accuracy during rapid fire. The bullet was heavy enough to retain energy at long range, but fast enough to achieve flat trajectory out to 400 yards. Marines experimented with different ammunition types for specific missions. Match-grade ammunition, manufactured to tighter specifications for superior accuracy, was issued to snipers for long-range work. Armor-piercing ammunition was available for engaging targets behind cover. Tracer ammunition helped spotters identify impacts and adjust fire. But the standard ball ammunition was accurate enough for most purposes, capable of consistent hits on man-sized targets at 500 yards, when fired from a properly zeroed rifle by a trained marksman. The only significant limitation was magazine capacity. The Springfield held 5 rounds compared to the Garands' 8. This meant more frequent reloading, which slowed rate of fire and created vulnerability during magazine changes. Marines trained extensively on rapid reloading using stripper clips, metal devices that held 5 cartridges and allowed them to be pressed into the rifle's magazine quickly. An experienced shooter could reload in 2 to 3 seconds, fast enough to maintain effectiveness in most situations. But the smaller magazine capacity remained a disadvantage in close-range firefights, where volume of fire mattered more than precision. This limitation was acceptable in the scout-sniper role, where engagements typically involved deliberate shooting at individual targets, rather than suppressive fire against multiple threats. A scout engaging a Japanese position at 500 yards had time to reload between shots. But the same limitation would have been crippling for a line infantryman facing a Banzai charge at 100 yards. This was why the Marine Corps issued Springfields only to specialists while equipping the majority of Marines with Garands. By 1945, as the Pacific War entered its final phase, the Springfield M1903 had established an almost legendary reputation among both American and Japanese forces. Marines who carried the weapon took pride in their marksmanship, knowing that their skills with the rifle set them apart from other troops. Japanese soldiers feared Marines in general, but particularly feared the long-range riflemen, recognizing that these specialists could kill at distances where return fire was impossible. The final vindication of the Springfield came during the Okinawa campaign, April through June 1945. The island featured varied terrain, including open valleys, ridgelines with long sightlines, and urban areas. Japanese defenders employed a mix of tactics, including prepared defensive positions, cave complexes, and occasional Banzai charges when positions became untenable. Marine Scout sniper sections operated throughout the campaign with consistent effectiveness. Gunnery Sergeant Arthur Tuttle, commanding a 6-man scout section with the 1st Marine Division, recorded his unit's activities in a detailed log. Over 73 days of combat, his section fired approximately 2,400 rounds and recorded 893 confirmed kills. The average engagement range was 430 yards. The longest confirmed kill was 740 yards, achieved by Corporal Donald Webster using a Springfield with an 8-power Unatel scope. These numbers represented a level of effectiveness impossible to achieve with any other weapon available to American forces. A six-man team with Springfields killed nearly 900 Japanese soldiers over 10 weeks of combat. The same team equipped with Garands would have fired more total rounds but achieved perhaps 350 to 400 kills, as the reduced accuracy at extreme range would have lowered hit rates significantly. Japanese defenders on Okinawa adapted to Marine marksmanship by limiting movement during daylight hours, by using covered approaches wherever possible, by positioning observers to spot Marine sniper positions. But these adaptations reduced Japanese operational effectiveness, forcing them to conduct necessary activities at night or under conditions that increased risk and reduced efficiency. The presence of Marine snipers created area denial effects disproportionate to their numbers. When the war ended in August 1945, the Marine Corps maintained the Springfield in its inventory despite plans to eventually transition fully to the M1 Garand. The Korean War, beginning in June 1950, saw Springfields return to combat when Marine units deployed with whatever weapons were immediately available. Once again, the rifle proved its value in mountainous terrain, where long sight lines made accuracy more valuable than rate of fire. It was not until the mid-1950s that the Marine Corps finally retired the Springfield M1903 from frontline service, replaced by the M1C and M1D sniper variants of the Garand, and eventually by more modern bolt-action rifles designed specifically for sniping. But the legacy of the Springfield remained embedded in Marine culture, representing an era when individual marksmanship was the determining factor in infantry combat effectiveness. The weapon had been called obsolete in 1936. Military theorists had declared that modern warfare had no place for slow-firing bolt-action rifles, that semi-automatic weapons would dominate future battlefields. They were correct for most applications, but they had failed to account for scenarios where accuracy mattered more than volume of fire, where patient precision was more valuable than rapid fire, where one well-aimed shot at 600 yards was worth more than 8 shots at 300 yards that might or might not hit. The Marines understood this because they had maintained an institutional commitment to marksmanship that other services had allowed to atrophy. They had trained every Marine to shoot accurately at long range, had maintained qualification standards that emphasized precision over speed, had created a culture where being an expert rifleman was a source of pride and a requirement for advancement. When the Pacific War created circumstances where these skills and this weapon proved decisive, the Marines were prepared. The Japanese soldiers who charged across 600 yards of open ground toward Marine positions learned the cost of that preparation. They discovered that spirit and courage, while admirable, could not overcome bullets fired accurately from beyond the range where they could return fire effectively. They learned that their doctrine of aggressive assault, which had worked against colonial forces in Southeast Asia, failed catastrophically against an enemy who could kill them before they closed to fighting distance. The statistics from major Pacific battles where Banzai charges occurred tell the story clearly. At Tarawa, Japanese forces charged Marine positions repeatedly, losing approximately 4,200 men over 3 days, while inflicting 1,000 American casualties. At Saipan, Banzai charges killed approximately 500 Americans while losing nearly 3,000 Japanese soldiers. At Peleliu, charges against Marine positions resulted in Japanese casualties exceeding American casualties by ratios of 8 or 10 to 1. The pattern was consistent. Japanese forces could not close with Marine positions without taking catastrophic losses, because Marines killed them at ranges where Japanese forces could not effectively return fire. This was the Springfield's legacy in the Pacific War. Not a revolutionary weapon, not a technological marvel, but a simple, reliable, accurate rifle in the hands of men trained to use it to its full potential. The weapon was obsolete by the standards of 1930s military theory. But that theory had been formulated in peacetime by officers who had not faced Japanese Banzai charges, who had not fought in terrain where 600-yard sightlines were common, who had not understood that some tactical problems were best solved by accuracy rather than firepower. The Marines understood these realities because they had fought in Haiti, Nicaragua, Dominican Republic, China, places where long-range marksmanship had proven valuable. They had maintained the Springfield because their institutional experience told them that under certain circumstances, A bolt-action rifle with superior accuracy was more useful than a semi-automatic weapon with higher rate of fire, and when the Pacific War validated that judgment, they had the weapons, the training, and the doctrine to exploit the advantage. Private First Class Tadashi Ogawa, one of the few Japanese survivors from Tarawa, spent the rest of the war in a prisoner camp in Hawaii. In a 1946 interview with American researchers studying Japanese military effectiveness, he was asked what surprised him most about fighting Americans. His answer was succinct: their marksmanship. We were taught that Americans could not shoot accurately. This was a lie. The Marines killed us at distances we believed were safe. They shot our officers before battles began. They shot our sergeants when officers fell. They destroyed our charges before we could reach them. We could not win against such shooting. All the courage in the world meant nothing when we were dead before we could fight. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.